Okay, there has been more drama on the Booktok recently, or I don't even want to say drama. There's just been some more discussions happening on the Booktok recently, and I thought I have some thoughts, and I thought, what is a better place to open a discussion than on my BookTube channel? So if you're not familiar with Booktok, you're not on Booktok, whatever, I don't blame you, first of all. I am weaning myself off TikTok as much as I can. If you are not on TikTok, there was a recent video where a individual was talking about classic literature and basically how they can tell if you haven't read classic lit. And they kind of were saying this in like a derogatory way, or that like you weren't someone who actually enjoyed reading if you didn't read classic literature. And obviously people got really heated in the comments about it and people were upset. I am not making this video to bash anyone. I just think it is an important discussion to be had, and I want to open it up and see what everyone else thinks. Also, hi, if you're new here, my name's Emily and this is my book channel. If you are interested in bookish and writing content as well as book-related discussions, please feel free to give my video a like and subscribe to my channel for more. Okay, so getting into this, I have a lot of feelings, and my feelings on classic literature have changed over time, and I definitely think classic literature has its place. However, I don't think, in my opinion, that classics are where we should base like the value of books, nor do I think that they are above scrutiny or people picking them apart, especially when you're relating them to the way that we view things in a modern era. And in my opinion, if you choose to not engage in classic literature for one reason or another, that is completely valid, and you don't owe anyone an explanation for that. We all read for different reasons, and I think that if the literary canon or classic literature doesn't fit in with things that you enjoy reading, you have no obligation to anyone to read it. I used to be really into reading classic literature because it was spoon-fed to me that that was the height of books, and if you didn't read classic lit, then you weren't a true book lover and you couldn't even call yourself a reader or whatever. And I never really pushed that onto other people. I just thought that it made me smarter, and that is wrong. First of all, that is not correct. You are not smarter or better than someone else just because you read classic literature. Let me just say that, like, full stop. It has its place, it has its moments, but then we need to let it go. And I kind of want to talk about maybe why and just open that up. And if you have thoughts about this, please comment down below what you're thinking. I would love to start a discussion and reach out to you and just kind of hear what everyone's thinking on this. I want to talk about the literary canon. If you don't know what that is, it's basically when, I think in like the early 1900s or something, a bunch of professors, and they were all of a certain demographic, sat down and decided, what books are we going to use to educate people, that we are going to use in school settings for English? Like, what do we find important in literature? Now, if you can imagine, for one reason or another, they stuck with a certain demographic of books, and that is basically mostly straight white men. Most of them old as well. That's just the truth. You can look it up. I don't know. You can be mad at me for pointing that out, but I don't really care. Because when you have a certain demographic looking at books, they're obviously going to choose books that they can relate to, that they find their own experiences in, and whatever. And so they're not going to be reading books by women of color and be like, oh yes, that is exactly the appropriate thing that we should be teaching because I don't relate to it. That's just not how they were thinking. And from today's standards, and even back then, I would say, like, that is not okay. And that is why, like, me and the literary canon do not get along. And I don't know if I mentioned this, so the literary canon is includes all of the literature that we count as like classics. So that includes like John Steinbeck, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, Homer's The Odyssey / the Iliad, Catcher in the Rye, Lord of the Flies, 1984, just all of those books. Anything that you would consider a classic is more than likely a part of the literary canon. And it's just basically a collection of books, what are seen as like essential. And I think that is like the word that they use specifically. Like, what about these books is essential? What are they telling us? What are they teaching us? So the canon is a collection of works of art that are deemed as important or more important than others. These books have withstood the test of time and they are still talked about today. Obviously, so like Shakespeare fits into this very easily. And every book is kind of compared to these because they are like the standard of literary fiction at this point, and then everything is like compared against them. And you'll see that even today with a lot of works in terms of like measuring them for literary conventions or imagery or, you know, whatever. These are most often the books that are taught in schools, at least in the US. I can't really speak outside of that because I haven't gone to school anywhere outside of the US, but broadly speaking, I'm talking about the US. Okay, that was just like a brief overview. If you're more interested in learning with the literary canon, I have some links in the description that you can like read up on, and I think it's really interesting, but obviously there's a lot that goes into this. So why do people think that reading classic lit is important? So I looked up a couple articles and I was reading up on it because at this point, I personally don't think that reading classic lit is that important. I should say reading classic lit can be important as long as we diversify and expand what that word means to us as a society, because there are other great works that are not considered classics just because of the people who were determining what is considered essential or good literature. I think that reading books from these different time periods is important. However, I think our scope of it right now is so narrow because of just years and years of teaching the same things, and that we should spread the wealth a little bit, you know. Instead of reading To Kill a Mockingbird in class, we should be reading A Raisin in the Sun or something along those lines, and like just diversify the reading and celebrate the diversity that could come within classic literature. I don't know if I'm even making sense, but it's that thought is somewhere in there. Why do people think classics are still so important? I found an article and this author kind of just wrote down 6 reasons why classic lit is still essential. And I think they're an English major. And I do want to point out that like 3 out of the 6 of these is like entirely subjective, but I just kind of want to use it to open up this discussion a bit more. So the first thing that they point out is that classics are considered classics for a reason. And I think I've already talked about this, but literally the reason is because somebody decided that it was. There's no other reason. I mean, to some extent, yes, most works in classic lit contain certain aspects that someone deemed more important than other things, whether that's like a use of like a motif, imagery, or the story that was being told was important. I'm not really sure, but like they've survived to this point because someone said that it should. And like, who gets to make that decision? Not me. Shakespeare was not even the most successful playwright in his time in London. He was up there, but he was not the most successful or the most well-known or most popular playwright. And yet he, to this day, is still taught in schools. I mean, I read Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. We performed multiple Shakespearean shows in my high school. It was because someone decided, or a collective of people decided, that he was important and that we were going to teach his words for forever, apparently. Am I saying that we shouldn't talk about Shakespeare or teach Shakespeare? No. Am I saying we put a lot of importance on him just because? Maybe. The next point they talk about is that you'll do better in English class. And again, I think that one is completely subjective. And yeah, are there some writing conventions in these books that are going to come up more often in your English classes? Yeah, of course. If you want to engage in that material, yeah, why wouldn't you? But if you're not someone who really cares about literature in that way, or you don't care about writing conventions, and like, I don't think that you need to read it. And then if you're reading it for class, like, yeah, you can delve into it. But if that's something that you struggle with anyway, like, why would you bring that into your life outside of class? I'm sorry. That doesn't make sense to me personally. This next point that they bring up, I do like. It talks about historical context. This could be like the one reason I think that we should continue reading classics. But again, it should always be a question of who wrote the book and why are you reading this book? Because I do think that if you read a book that was written in the 1800s, yeah, you get a very clear sense of what their style was like, what was important to them, what their day-to-day life was like, what readers found fascinating, what they found funny, what they found tragic, what their relationships were like, what they wore. Like, those are all really interesting and important historical contextual things that in a modern book can be lost. That I do think I understand. However, if we're just reading certain books, I just think we should pay more attention to why we're reading which books we're reading. And like, especially for school, because I'm really sorry, like there was no reason that in my English class in high school, we had to read 2 or 3 books that had the N-word in it repeatedly, or women being assaulted multiple times in books. Like, I just don't, but like having a queer author or queer character or, you know, anyone outside of that is like not okay, or we don't teach about that because that's not okay. I just don't understand like how that like line is defined or why it's defined the way that it is. And like, I just don't get it. The next thing that I talk about is understanding literary references like outside of books. I suppose like if you want to know that, but also you could just Google it. Honestly, like if you're really that interested in it and you're like, oh, okay, I see what they did there. I don't think like it makes you better than someone to be like that Leonardo DiCaprio gif where he's like, I know that one, or whatever, whatever the gif is. I don't think it makes you better than someone just because you like understood a reference to something. Also, a lot of the references that are in movies or in day-to-day life phrases and everything, like most of the time people know what they are anyway. I don't know. I guess it could be cool if you're into that, and that's okay if you are. I don't think that's the most important reason why you should read classic lit. The next point they talk about is that it helps you appreciate and love other books that are not classics. I could get behind this a little bit. It does invite you to dig into the text a bit deeper and to ask questions and to really try and understand what the author is doing. And you know, there's that meme about like the teacher says, oh, the curtain is blue because it represents the depression and the sadness. And the author was like, no, the curtain is just blue. And that was a meme for a long time. And I actually do think that that has been kind of harmful in terms of like media literacy, because now people aren't thinking about the media that they're taking in. I do actually think that could be harmful. But I don't necessarily think you need to read a bunch of classic literature to do that. I think you just need to be invited to think more about the text in general. But also, like, depending on why you read books in the first place, maybe you aren't supposed to think so much about it. You know, if you're reading just like a cheesy romance book because you want to escape and like have this romance and read about other characters for a while, like I think it's totally valid to not want to delve deeper into that, because what you're getting from it is just the experience of receiving the material, and sometimes thinking about it can just like ruin that experience. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. And the last thing that they say is that they will change your life. And again, that's super subjective, and basically like what they're saying is that like it'll change your view of the world and like the output that you are receiving, or that you'll understand different parts of society, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think there's other ways to do that, but that's okay. That's okay. I think the thing that upsets me about it when people kind of have this elitist attitude about classic literature is that sometimes when they say like, oh, you don't read classic lit, they're kind of saying, oh, you don't take reading books seriously, or you're not actually a reader because you don't read literature the way I do. They don't want to take you seriously anymore. I think that brings us to another point, and that question is, why do we read? And why do you personally read? For me, I read for a million different reasons. You know, I read certain books because I want to learn something new. I read other books because I want to connect to people who are different than me and understand their experience. Sometimes I just want to be entertained. I read a lot of fantasy and I write a lot of fantasy because I love magic and the escapism that fantasy gives me. Sometimes I want to learn about other cultures or things that happened in the past. Classic literature could fit maybe into some of those pieces, but definitely not all of them. And for some people, analyzing the text and finding hidden secrets that the author put in there, or finding literary conventions in the works that they read, is super fun to them. And I do that sometimes to some extent. I just finished annotating If We Were Villains, and that vlog is going to be out like next week or something, and I'll talk about this then. I loved that I understood Shakespeare enough to find the hidden meanings in the text that the author was putting in there. But you don't necessarily need to be a huge fan of Shakespeare to like do that, and not everyone is going to find that enjoyable. Same with House of Leaves. I really loved the mental challenge that book was for me, but for a ton of people, that book comes off as really pretentious and difficult to read for no reason. And if you're someone who just reads for entertainment and you don't want to use a lot of your brain power, I think you have every right to do that. And if that's why you read, that's okay. And like, you should still celebrate that and love the books that you read. I also found something really interesting when I was researching for this video. And this kind of leaks back into the whole literary canon being very Eurocentric and white male dominated. And that's that recently, I think the study was in 2021, they did a poll, and of the top 10 best-selling female authors, only 19% of their readers were men. And this includes Jane Austen, Margaret Atwood, Danielle Steele, you know, all of these very prominent female authors, and only 19% of their readership was men. Whereas for the top 10 male authors, 45% of their readership was women. And I just think that that's interesting. And I'm just gonna let that statistic sit with you. And you can think about maybe why that is. And you don't have to tell me why. You can just sit in that. And I just think it's interesting because, for example, Stephen King has not written very many women-led stories. And a lot of the women in his stories, I would say, are very horribly represented or stereotyped. Not to mention some of the other issues he has in his works. But he still has a pretty prominent female audience. And it's interesting because 99% of the time, the thing that I hear when I ask why men don't read female authors is because they don't relate to the story or the characters. And it's always interesting to me how people like Stephen King can have such high female readership, and yet that is not the same the other way around. Because clearly people can relate to things that are not their own experiences. I mean, people of color or queer people have to do it all the time when engaging in very popular literature. I don't know. And then this brings me all the way back to like, what is required reading in class? If you fall into one of those marginalized groups, why would you want to have stories that horribly misrepresent and stereotype you or speak about your demographic very harmfully, like seen as an educational resource and then like have to talk about it to other people in the class? I think it would be one thing and pretty valuable if you were to do that and like tear it apart and kind of dissect it and everything, but also like, why should we be making people do that? And I really just think we should consider alternatives and maybe rotate what books we talk about. I just question like, why are we still reading To Kill a Mockingbird when there are plenty of other stories that center Black voices that we can use to talk about racism during that same time period? I don't know. These are all just questions I have. Obviously, I am not an expert, and other people might have really excellent opinions or more education about this topic. If you do, I would love to hear them. However, just be really civil in the comments, especially when we're talking about things that can be really harmful or offensive to people. I just wanted to open this up. I'm gonna have some links on the description if you want to do some further reading on this. I found this really fascinating, and I think it's a great discussion that needs to be had as times change. Like, should the classics that we talk about and read change? You know, I think it's still valuable to some extent that we acknowledge that those books existed. I'm not saying that we should burn them or get rid of them. I think we should still talk about them, but I also think that when talking about our education and like what we deem as important or more important than other books, we should be considering why and maybe consider changing what we deem as more important than other things. I just wanted to open this up. I can't wait to read everyone's comments down below. Thank you so much for being here as always. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one.